The sun was beginning its slow descent when Eliza stumbled down the dusty road, the heat of the day still clinging to the earth. Her feet were raw and aching, the soles blistered from days of walking barefoot over gravel and roots. Each step sent a sting through her legs, but she pressed on because there was nowhere else to go. She clutched the pitiful bundle they had allowed her to take, an old wool blanket full of holes, a tin cup dented beyond shape, and 2 dresses worn so thin they nearly turned to threads in her hands. That was all her life amounted to in her family's eyes. That was all she was worth. Useless, her mother had hissed earlier that morning, her lip curling as if the word itself tasted foul. You can't even fetch a pail of water without tripping. You can't cook without burning the pot. What good are you, girl? You're nothing but another mouth to feed. Her father hadn't defended her. He had only leaned back in his chair and muttered that they couldn't afford to keep a daughter who did nothing. Then, as though she were livestock to be bartered, he accepted the coins from the man who had ridden up to their door, a rough-looking fellow who smelled of horse sweat and cheap whiskey. He hadn't even looked at Eliza properly, just jerked his thumb toward the horse and told her to climb up. She had no choice. No tears were shed when she left. No goodbyes were spoken. Her mother had turned back to the kitchen, her siblings had gone on playing in the yard, and her father had slipped the coins into his pocket. That was the last she saw of them. The whiskey man had taken her north, riding hard for 2 days without offering more than a crust of bread and a canteen of stale water. She didn't know what waited for her, didn't dare to ask, only clung to the horse and tried to keep her trembling hidden. When at last they came to a clearing deep in the mountains, the air sharp with the scent of pine, she saw a cabin of rough-hewn logs standing alone against the wilderness. The man reined in his horse, jerked his head toward the cabin, and said only, "He's yours now." Before Eliza could ask who he was, the rider gave her a shove from the saddle. She fell hard to the ground, clutching her bundle, and by the time she scrambled up, the man was already turning his horse back down the trail. Dust rose behind him, and then he was gone. Eliza stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She turned slowly toward the cabin, where a figure stood watching her from the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hair that hung untamed to his collar and a beard that shadowed his jaw. His eyes, dark and storm-colored, studied her with a look that was not cruel but heavy, as though he were weighing something in his mind. His hands, large and scarred, rested at his sides. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eliza clutched her bundle tighter, her throat dry, fear prickling her skin. Then his voice came, deep and slow, carrying a kind of quiet strength. "You hungry?" The question was so unexpected, so simple, that she could only nod. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. He turned, motioned her toward the cabin. "Come in, then." She hesitated, glancing once at the empty road, but there was no sign of the horseman who had left her. The wilderness stretched endless in every direction. She had no choice but to follow. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the glow of the small iron stove where a pot simmered. The air smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. There was one chair at the table, a bed built from timber in the corner, shelves lined with jars of beans and dried herbs. Sparse, yes, but far warmer than any place she had known. The man, she didn't yet know his name, took a ladle and filled a bowl with stew, thick with potatoes and venison. He set it in front of her without a word. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, balancing the bowl in her shaking hands, and ate as though she hadn't seen food in weeks. She expected him to sneer, to make a remark about her hunger, but when she dared to glance up, his eyes only held a kind of quiet sadness. That night, when the fire was crackling low, he took a blanket to the floor and gestured to the bed. "You take it. I'll manage here." Eliza lay down, though she did not sleep. She stared at the log beams above, her mind racing with memories of her mother's cold eyes, her father's silence, her siblings' indifference. She had been thrown away like broken furniture, abandoned because she wasn't good enough. The tears came hot and silent, soaking the pillow, and she buried her face so he would not hear. But then she thought of his voice, steady and calm, asking if she was hungry. She thought of his rough hands ladling stew into her bowl, of the fire he had built to warm the cabin, of the way he had offered her the bed without hesitation. For the first time in years, she did not feel completely unwanted. When dawn spilled across the clearing, she stepped outside to find him already splitting wood, each strike of the axe sure and strong. He paused, resting on the handle, and looked at her with that same storm-gray gaze. "World thinks you're useless," he said at last, his voice even. "Ain't a soul useless if they got breath in their lungs. You stay here long as you need. Cabin's big enough for two." Eliza felt something stir inside her, a faint warmth she hadn't known she could feel. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was hope, and that was enough. The weeks that followed were unlike any Eliza had ever known. The days were long, filled with work from sunup to sundown, yet she did not feel the gnawing emptiness that had once filled her in her parents' home. Here in the mountains, every breath was sharp with pine and wood smoke, every sound alive with rushing streams and whispering trees. And though she often stumbled, often failed at the tasks Silas set before her, she was never met with scorn. At first, her body resisted. Carrying buckets of water from the stream left her arms shaking and her shoulders raw. Her fingers blistered when she tried to split kindling with a dull axe. Once, when she tripped with a pail of milk and spilled the precious liquid across the dirt, she fell to her knees, shaking, certain the man would strike her or curse her uselessness. But Silas only crouched beside her, steady as stone, and said, "Next time, keep your steps slow. Don't matter if it takes longer, just matters that you get there." He showed her how to steady herself, how to carry loads close to her body, how to take small, certain steps instead of rushing. His patience bewildered her, and slowly, her clumsy movements began to change. By the end of the first month, she could fetch water without spilling, light a fire without fumbling, and mend torn cloth with tidy stitches. She was not perfect, but she was improving, and Silas noticed. Sometimes he'd grunt in approval, or give her a nod that made her chest swell with pride. When autumn crept into the valley, the leaves turning golden red, Silas began to work on a second cabin. Eliza watched him at first, unsure what he was building, until one morning he handed her a hammer. "You'll help," he said simply. Her hands were small and clumsy with the heavy tool, but he showed her where to place the nails, how to hold the beam steady while he drove them in with powerful swings. She hauled stones from the riverbed until her back ached, helped stack logs into place, and scraped sap from pine trunks to seal the cracks. Every night, she collapsed by the fire, her muscles burning, but every morning she rose eager to do more. For the first time in her life, she felt the joy of seeing something grow beneath her hands. When the roof was finished and the last stone was laid into the hearth, Silas stood in the doorway of the new cabin and watched her sweep wood shavings from the floor. His broad shoulders filled the frame, his expression unreadable. Eliza straightened, brushing dust from her apron, and asked softly, "What will this cabin be used for?" His eyes softened, though his voice stayed firm. "It's yours," he said. She blinked, not understanding. "Mine," he nodded, folding his arms across his chest. "World tossed you out like you're nothing. But I don't hold with that. A woman ought to have a home of her own. Built this one for you." His voice caught slightly, and he cleared his throat before adding, "And if you'll have me, I'll call you wife. Not to own you, not to bind you. Just reckon two lonely folks can make one whole life if they try." Eliza stared at him, her heart thundering in her chest. Her family's voices rose in her memory, useless, clumsy, unwanted, but they were drowned out by the sight of this man who had spent weeks shaping wood and stone into shelter for her. He had not asked for coin or service in return. He had not mocked her fumbling efforts. Instead, he had placed tools in her hands, shown her patience, and taught her that her worth was not measured in speed or perfection, but in persistence. She set her broom aside, trembling. "You built me a cabin," she whispered, voice breaking. "And called me wife." Her throat tightened with tears. "I'll try, Silas. I'll try with you." For a moment, his expression stayed hard, as though he feared to hope. Then a slow, uneven smile tugged at his mouth. It was not polished, not practiced, but it transformed his face into something warmer than the autumn sun. "Then we'll make it work," he said. That evening, they lit the hearth in the new cabin together. Eliza carefully fed kindling into the stone fireplace, and Silas bent beside her, striking the flint until sparks caught. The flames leapt up, crackling, casting golden light across the rough walls. She spread the small rug she had woven across the floor, and Silas carried in a quilt he had bartered for years ago. The little room, simple as it was, glowed with the warmth of a true home. When night fell, she lay beneath the quilt, listening to the mountain wind whistle through the pines, Silas's steady breathing close beside her. She thought of the dirt road where she had been cast off, of the way she had stood trembling with nothing but a bundle in her arms. That girl was gone now. She was no longer a burden, no longer discarded. She had hauled stones for her own hearth, raised beams for her own roof, and shared the work of her own home. The tears that came this time were different. They were warm, not bitter, born not of despair but of wonder. For the first time, she belonged, not because someone had demanded it, but because someone had chosen her. And she, in turn, had chosen him. As the fire flickered low, Eliza turned toward Silas and whispered into the quiet, "I was nothing before. But now I am yours." Silas shifted closer, his hand finding hers in the dark. He didn't speak, but the steady pressure of his fingers told her all she needed. In the heart of the wilderness, in a cabin built by rough hands and newfound hope, Eliza was no longer useless. She was a wife. She was wanted. And at last, she was home.